I thought this would be another ordinary Motherson road trip. Coffee stops, the same old playlists, a little patch of silence between us. Instead, halfway down a rain-thick highway, George reached across and handed me a small envelope. What he told me next stopped my breath and rewrote everything I thought I knew about our future. Before we begin, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. Are you in Cleveland, Phoenix, Tampa, or somewhere I've never seen except on a weather map? I want to know who's listening tonight. People who know me say I like to plan. I'm Sharon, 52, practical enough to pack an extra sweater, sentimental enough to keep the ticket stub from the very first concert George and I ever went to together, and stubborn enough to believe that most problems smooth out with time and a conversation. George, my son, is 31. He's not dramatic. He's the sort of man who clears the table with steady hands and apologizes if he has to sit down at the kitchen table without offering to help. He's been my anchor in ways I never fully appreciated until the day we left. We left on a Wednesday morning. The sky was the color of unpolished pewter, and the house smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner I'd always use. He came in with his duffel slung over one shoulder, and that same half-smile he gets when he knows I'm watching him from the doorway. We hadn't been on a road trip like that since he was little. The kind of trip where you take turns telling stories and the miles stitched themselves together with radio static and jokes about rest stops. This time the destination was a stretch of coastline I loved as a younger woman, a place where the salt air always seemed to make things simpler. Driving with George felt, at first, like falling back into an old, comfortable rhythm. He drove the first leg, his knuckles the pale color of someone who trusted his hands on the wheel. We had the windows down even though the air was cool. The road smelled of wet asphalt and pine sap. We told each other things we usually left unsaid. About neighbors, about appliances that need fixing. About friends of his who were getting married, and friends of mine who were moving to Florida. Conversation landed like warm stones into a pond. The surface rippled, and then smoothed over. But there was a softness behind his eyes I couldn't read. It was the look he got when he was about to do something that made him both nervous and resolute. I tried to find the right moment between a turnpike exit and a rest area to ask. He answered before I managed the question. "You ever think about how little time we actually get?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the road. "Every day," I said, and that was honest. The truth had been sitting like a pebble in my shoe for months. I was no longer the woman I used to be, and George was no longer the boy who fell asleep with his head on my shoulder. The realization was sharp and tender at once. We stopped at a diner with a flickering neon sign that hummed in the evening like a tired kitchen moth. The waitress knew the regulars by name. The coffee came in a chipped porcelain pot. George ordered pie for both of us. He told me about a project he was proud of, about how he'd finally felt like he'd found a rhythm at work. He told me small things that made my heart lift. The way his face looked in sunlight when he smiled, the new laugh he'd learned from a friend. I told him about the lighthouse we were going to visit, about how the keeper used to let me stand on the rocks as a kid and shout at the gulls. When we left the diner, the rain began in earnest, a steady silver curtain, and the windshield wipers sang a patient song. We checked into a modest motel by the sea. Floral wallpaper, a crooked lamp, the kind of room that smells faintly of lavender and someone else's memories. The air in the room had the humid hush of a place that had been waiting. George unpacked in silence, folded his shirts with that careful patience he's always had. and then sat on the edge of the bed, with something small in his hands. He was quieter than I had ever seen him. There was a trembling around his mouth that I hadn't noticed under years of motherly blindness. I wanted to reach out to touch his arm the way one touches something fragile in a shop window, but I didn't want to force words out of him. That would have been our old dance, me stepping forward and him retreating. This time he chose the moment himself. "Mom," he said, and his voice was small and unvarnished. "I want you to know something. I didn't want to tell you over the phone. I wanted to do it properly. Face to face. The phrase divides what was from what will be." I sat opposite him, my hands in my lap, the light above us casting soft circles on the bedspread. Rain tapped the window in a steady rhythm. Like an impatient drummer, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was the kind of envelope you keep folded inside a book. It had the slight curve where it had been carried close to a chest. He handed it to me with both hands like it was something sacred. My breath hitched. Inside, folded like a fragile secret, was a photograph and a scrap of handwriting. The photograph showed a small pair of shoes. The canvas kind with Velcro straps, the kind I used to buy when he was a boy. Beside the shoes was a little drawing, a stick figure with a curved smile, and under it, in uneven letters, was the word, Nana. For a moment, my brain did that odd thing where everything takes the color of water. The edges soften, sounds thin, and some faraway clock continues to click when nothing else makes sense. My hands trembled. "George," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's. "I'm a father," he said simply. It was not a question, and it did not seek permission. It hung between us like a candle flame. I had imagined surprises, but never this, the quiet, fierce declaration of a life that had been lived partly apart from me. He told me then, steady and plain, about the months he'd been keeping to himself, about how he'd been worried about my reaction, about how he'd been learning, changing, and quietly building a world for the little person in the photograph. He told me about the mother, the woman who had refused to take his pity and who had taught him how to be gentle, and about the way their child held his finger like a tiny claim on a future he had once been afraid to imagine. My first thought was a little silly. I had no idea whether I should call him grandson or grandchild, or if names still mattered. I felt the old reflex, the mother reflex, leap forward, protective and instantly tender. But layered on top of that was another current, a wash of grief for the lost time. For the years George had kept part of his life folded away from me. I felt betrayed, and then almost immediately I felt ashamed of feeling betrayed. Because who was I to demand the timeline of his life? He watched me as I read the note. There was no defensiveness in him, only a kind of vulnerable truth. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd run. Afraid I'd lose you. I wanted you to know me now, fully. Not the version I was 10 years ago. There are moments in life when the air tastes different, suddenly sharpened. Like the first sip of cold water after a long walk. This was one of them." I thought of all the small ways I had tried to hold him without smothering him. The advice I'd given, and the silence I'd kept. I thought of how, in the quiet where the rain met the sea, we were both remaking ourselves as parents and children again. We talked for hours, not the fractured, apologetic kind of talk, but the kind that builds a room out of words. He told me about the little rituals, mornings that began with oatmeal and a song, the absurdity of trying to assemble a baby monitor, the way nights were punctuated by tiny hands seeking reassurance. I told him about the first time I had held him, the terror and the joy mixed like two colors that refused to stay separate. He listened when I stumbled over the past, when I admitted where I had been wrong, where I had been distant. He did not gloat or judge. He accepted the apology I hadn't known I needed to make. At one point, he stood and walked to the window. "I didn't tell you because I was worried," he said finally. "Worried you'd think I wasn't ready. But I've been ready in the ways that matter. I wanted you to see that." He turned back to me, and in that look there was nothing but a steady, hard-won tenderness. "You should have told me sooner," I said, and the honesty in my voice surprised me more than it surprised him. "I know," he said, "but I wanted this trip to be our thing. I wanted to bring you here so you could meet him properly. Tomorrow, if you want." That last sentence, "if you want," cradled 1,000 possibilities. "Of course I want," I said, my voice steady around the words like a hand around a cup. We sat there for a long while afterwards, two silhouettes in a small motel room with a photograph between us, the rain outside learning the rhythm of our talk. By the time the rain eased, the mood of the room had shifted. We had rebuilt the bridge between us, not by lectures or confrontation, but by shared vulnerability. George had offered me the trust of being included. I accepted it, breathless and grateful. The next morning, the air smelled of salt and wet sand. We went to meet the child. And when he ran toward us, small feet pounding the beach, eyes bright as sea glass, I realized the truth that would stay with me forever. Family isn't built by blood or years. It's built by the courage to love, again and again, no matter when the truth arrives.